Welcome to Checkpoint. Looking forward to your feedback, so please use the hashtag Checkpoint on Twitter. The SMS number is 22155. Welcome to the program. Today we're talking about regulating churches in the country. This is, of course, after Prayer Predators and Makri Injili aired last Sunday, exposing the work of Victor Kenyan. Panel tonight, we've tried to pick as many people with as many varied opinions as we possibly can, and yours, as if you will be included as well. My panel today, eclectic gentleman, Bishop David Okende, who's from Christ is the Answer Ministries. Thank you for joining us. And also from the Evangelical Alliance of Kenya, we have Dr. Oscar Githua. These two gentlemen you saw in John Allen Namo's piece. Dr. Githua is a forensic psychologist and will be helping us look into why we get duped so easily in the country. Next to him, Reverend Dr. Robert Langat, who's from the Africa Gospel Church and who's also a board member of the Evangelical Alliance of Kenya. Thank you. Dr. Makodingo Washington, whom we've seen before on Checkpoint, and who will give us that perspective from the outside looking in. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us tonight. Let's start with you, Bishop Oginde. The government is today talking about more regulation. They're going to take a look at just how churches are being registered in the country, with an aim at seeing if there are any loopholes and how to prevent this from happening. What are your thoughts on government regulating the work of churches?
Well, the law already provides for some level of regulation. Once you are registered as a church, you are registered under the Societies Act, and there are parameters and guidelines that determine what you can and you cannot do. So in that sense, there's some level of regulation that is already in place. So I would say it will depend on how far they want to push it, how much further they want to go. That's when we could raise a red flag or say, yeah, that's good, because there indeed is a need for some level of regulation that would ensure that people do not just get into the system and abuse that which is already there. Okay. So at this point, I wouldn't say unless and until we hear what the government is up to.
Okay, all right. Dr. Langat, we talk about this, but then there's also the possibility of self-regulation. Many would say that that's not working. NCCK might not be doing the job it's meant to do, and hence the government coming in, and hence this expose that's come up. What do you think about self-regulation? Are you able to do that at the moment?
It's unfortunate that we've had to wait until this moment where the government has to regulate church, because the early church had self-regulatory mechanisms. A lot of heretics were pushed out of the church within the early church. I think there is a place for the government to regulate, but it needs, I agree with Bishop Okinde, that it needs to be done with a lot of care, because there are also issues of constitutionalism as far as the freedom of worship and religion is concerned. But the best mechanism is the mechanism of self-regulation, which unfortunately to some extent the body of Christ at the moment in Kenya is ill-prepared to provide those self-regulatory mechanisms.
So many would say then, because, and it, as you put it yourself, that the church has failed to regulate itself, and that therefore the regulation must come from outside. Is this, would this be a fair assessment, that the church has failed to regulate itself? I mean, Victor Kenyari's own mother was jailed for 2 years for just about the same thing. And it's surprising that this all came from outside the church, that this was an investigative piece that was done by a media house. What of those people who are now saying the church has failed to regulate itself? What would you say?
I don't think the church has completely failed to regulate itself. We do have organs such as the National Council of Churches that expect its members to subscribe to a certain mode of behavior in worship. We do have the Evangelical Alliance of Kenya, which actually the bulk of the Protestant world in this country is a part of. So I wouldn't say that we have entirely failed. I think we have come to where we are today because of the freedom of worship, But also, my point of contention is because a number of worshippers have shifted away from mainline churches, which normally have well-trained pastors in theology and biblical hermeneutics. That has been the undoing of the church. The rain began to fall on us the time we shifted away from those mainline churches with sound biblical doctrines.
Okay. All right.
And that's where we need to get back as a church.
Okay, and we'll come back to that because that's an interesting point. Dr. Makodingo, what are your thoughts on this, and in particular about, you know, the number of churches that he's mentioning? Just give us your thoughts on everything that you've seen and the conversations we've had over the past week.
Thank you. I think all the churches have problems. I think fundamentally, whether small, whether Kanyari, at the Kanyari level or at what we call mainstream churches, I think there are fundamental problems within the system itself, yeah, within the system of belief, within Christianity itself. But there are these churches that are in the middle. You know, there is the one that deals with the downtrodden, the one in my village, that has fairly good structured. The church doesn't collect a lot of money. The pastor keeps crying that if you don't collect much money, I don't really make any money.
It's not on the salary.
Yeah, it doesn't really on the salaries. It depends on village support. Then there is the one in Nairobi, the downtrodden, but in Nairobi, you know, the nano evangelisms, the one that caters for the domestic house workers. Yeah, these are the ones that are filled with a lot of the miracles, because those people also happen to be people who have really lost hope.
Right.
So, you know, they have turned to be like politicians. They're selling a lot of hope. And when you sell hope, you'll always find people on the other side to deceive. Then there is the ones who have just escaped that level. They started there actually, but now they've reached a level where their pastors can afford to take luxury trips to South Africa to play golf. Yeah? The type that caters for the middle class, the guys who go drinking on a Saturday evening. Then on Sunday morning, they feel like they need to appease, you know, their maker and be right with him, and stagger into church drunk. Then there is the elite churches. Yeah? Now the elite churches cater for a very different group of people. There is that group of people who want to make it, so they'll go to those churches and they are taught the gospel of possessing, so they see big cars and they hope that one day they'll get those.
Right.
But then there is also the land grabbers, yeah, the political wheeler dealers, the big moneyed people who spend the whole week doing all manner of things, grabbing land and, you know, destroying public morality. Then on Sunday, they just want to go to a place where they'll sit, there'll be a bit of order, and where they can deposit $1 million shillings out of the 300 million that they swindled someone during the week. That is it. I mean, at the end of the day, that is the spectrum of the churches we have.
Okay.
They can't self-regulate. I mean, they have to be regulated, in my opinion, by the state.
Right.
Because they have such varied concepts. Even the doctrine is actually different. The Protestants and the Catholics have fundamental differences on the doctrine.
Right.
But you can no longer rely on the Bible and the so-called truth of the Bible to actually assist them to come together in a self-regulating mechanism.
Okay. We'll come to you, Dr. Githuwa, in just a moment, but I'd like you to respond to that, Bishop Oginde. And of course, talking about the many churches that are mushrooming and the Protestants protesting, and we all remember that from the Catholics. And now, you know, people are confused. Which of these main churches that Dr. Langat said we're straying away from, which ones are those fundamentally? Because I think it gets to a point there are so many. NCCK itself has 26 denominations under it.
You see, it's an issue of the regulatory structure, because the government already put in a mechanism for registration. And anybody, you can go and register a church today if you wish. There is no requirement that you belong to any group. So whereas there are groups like NCCK, like EAK and the other, these are voluntary membership alliances.
Bishop, is it time then that NCCK played a stronger role in the registration of churches, going to the government and saying, no, before somebody comes to you, we must first vet them? Is that something?
Then you go back to the problem of the Constitution. The Constitution guarantees the freedom of association, and churches are registered under societies, because a society is a gathering of people who have a common interest. So you cannot go that direction without violating the Constitution. Because if I decide I want to associate with this group that is here today, we want to form our own association, you can't say no. An external person cannot stop us from gathering to express whatever we want to express. That is the nature of the Constitution that we have given to ourselves. So it provides for us that freedom of association, that 5 of us, 10 of us, 50 of us, 1,000 of us, 1,000,000 of us can come together with a common interest, and we have the right to associate as a people. Therefore, there can be no mechanism that makes it mandatory for a group of people or a church to belong to NCCK or to EAK. It has to be voluntary. And that is where the problem is, because now there are so many of these churches that actually, the majority of the churches in this country don't belong to any umbrella body.
There you go.
They are individual churches. They do whatever they wish. They thought this thing is working. Only to realize that they were being duped. Any right-thinking person knows that this is not a real pastor. This is not what is happening there is not what is happening in every church. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't think he has dented anything. Other than those people who are enemies of the church or who have something against the church. They say, I've always known that this is what is happening in the church. But that doesn't affect the church.
It doesn't affect the church.
No.
He's not capable of doing so. All right. Okay. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And on that note, Pete Njenga on Twitter says, I'm watching the interview now. I'm glad I am now agnostic. Guys, belief and truth are not synonymous. Well, that talks a little bit about what you've just said, but what are your thoughts? Continue to send them in. The hashtag is Checkpoint on Twitter, and SMS 22155. We'll sample your views a little later on, but we've talked about all of this. As always, here on The Point of News, we ask, what's the point?
Indeed, Yvonne, there always is a point of the discussions that we have on Checkpoint, and I'm going to start with a voice that was remarkably absent, according to quite a number of people, in this past week since the expose on Victor Kanyari, and that was from various parts of the church. One of the earliest roles of bishops in the Christian faith was to speak out against heresy. And in fact, that tenet, in terms of speaking out against wrongdoing, is enshrined in almost every religion that we have today in Kenya and around the world, be it Islam, be it Buddhism or Christianity. Why is it that without there being an actual structure or institution that governs churches, that churches themselves cannot come out and speak out against the misuse of the canon and the misuse of the tenets of their religion? That was something that was absent. Secondly, and one thing that also will be considered in coming days, is the review of the Societies Act. The Attorney General Githu Muigai has a very, very dicey situation on his hands should he choose to review the Societies Act with regard to the governance on churches by himself. It is, after all, something that could run counter to the freedom to a very key right in our constitution, which is freedom of worship. So consultation there will need to be an important part of Githu Muigai and the government's review of the Societies Act going forward in the regulation of churches. But third and finally, something that has been said by Dr. Githu as well as other panelists today is that hope is one of the most powerful drugs, and if people are selling hope, there'll always be people to buy it. So why don't we all, including the government, get into the business of hope? And the government can do this in very simple ways, by providing alternatives to the people who are suffering under the yoke of poverty. There is no shame like the shame of poverty, William Ruto said in one of the speeches after they were inaugurated as president and deputy president. It is time for the government to live up to that promise and provide people with the kind of alternatives that they need, so that poverty, desperation should no longer be part of the lexicon of many Kenyans who would then turn to churches that would prey on their faith. And that is the point.